The town had long forgotten her face, but the desert never forgets. Years ago, the wife had been cast out beneath a storm of whispers, her reputation shattered by the very man who once vowed to protect her. He had painted her as a traitor, a burden, a shame too heavy for his proud shoulders to bear. With nothing but silence as her companion, she vanished into the horizon, swallowed by the dust of the Old West. Yet every night, the truth simmered within her like a fire too fierce to die. Her husband thrived in her absence. He became a man admired by neighbors, a symbol of honor and grit. He built his fortune on the lie that she had been the ruin of him, and the town believed every word. His land prospered, his name grew strong, and his power became law. But power built on deceit carries cracks invisible to the eye, and sooner or later, time sends someone back to widen them. Years turned her suffering into steel. She was no longer the broken woman dragged by shame, but someone who had carved survival into her very bones. The wind of the plains had become her teacher, hardship her ally. She returned not with tears in her eyes, but with a gaze sharp enough to pierce through every falsehood that had sheltered her husband's pride. The day she rode back into town, heads turned as if a ghost had wandered into the living. Dust clung to her boots. The scars of exile marked her face, and yet her presence commanded a silence no one dared break. She carried with her not just the weight of memory, but the proof of lies, secrets long buried, truths her husband had sworn would never surface. And as her shadow stretched across the main street, her husband felt the ground beneath him tremble. For the West had returned her not as a victim, but as a reckoning. What she carried was more dangerous than a revolver. It was the truth, and the truth had finally come home to collect its debt. The townsfolk gathered in silence as she dismounted her horse, the sound of her boots striking the wooden boards echoing through the street like the tolling of a bell. Children who had only heard whispers of her story hid behind their mothers, while men who once repeated her husband's lies shifted uncomfortably beneath her gaze. She did not come cloaked in weakness, but in the dignity of survival, her presence heavier than any weapon. Every step she took seemed to peel back the layers of deceit that had long shielded the man who betrayed her. Her husband stood on the porch of the saloon, his hat pulled low to hide the storm gathering in his eyes. For years, he had built himself as a man untouchable, respected, and envied. But as she approached, the foundation of that image began to crumble. He had counted on her silence, her absence, her shame. What he never expected was her return, not as a broken memory, but as living proof of his falsehoods. The murmurs grew louder among the crowd. Old memories, once buried, clawed their way to the surface. Some remembered the night she was cast out, the accusations that stained her name, the harsh words her husband had shouted in the heat of anger. Others recalled her kindness, her quiet strength, and wondered if perhaps they had been too quick to judge. Now the truth hovered in the air like smoke, waiting to ignite. She stopped just a few paces away from him, her eyes locked on his, unwavering. Her voice carried the weight of the desert winds, steady and sharp. "You built your life on lies," she said, each word striking like a hammer. But lies, no matter how heavy, cannot bury the truth forever. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the words striking deeper than any bullet. Her husband flinched, but he held his ground, his pride still clinging desperately to its throne. The West was watching, not just the town, but the land itself. In that moment, it felt as though the soil, the wind, and the sky bore witness to a reckoning long overdue. And as silence stretched across the street, everyone knew. This was not just a confrontation between man and woman, but between truth and deception, between justice and pride. Her husband straightened, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You think anyone will believe you now?" he sneered, his voice dripping with the confidence of a man who had held power too long. "You've been gone for years. You're nothing but a ghost, and ghosts don't change the world of the living." His words drew a few nervous chuckles from the men behind him, but the sound rang hollow, brittle against the rising tide of tension. She reached into the satchel at her side, pulling out a bundle wrapped in worn cloth. With deliberate care, she unraveled it, revealing letters, deeds, and records, proof of the wealth he claimed as his own, wealth that had in truth been stolen from her family's inheritance. The papers fluttered in the wind, undeniable as the sun above. The crowd leaned closer, their murmurs rising to disbelief and outrage. The fortress of lies he had built for years now stood exposed, stripped bare by the very woman he had cast away. Her husband's face turned pale, his smirk faltering. He reached for the papers, but she pulled them back, holding them high for all to see. "These fields you claim," she declared, her voice carrying to the farthest corner of the street, "were never yours. You built your name on my ruin, and you left me to die in shame while you wore a crown of stolen honor." Her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with the raw power of truth long suppressed. The sheriff stepped forward then, his hand resting on his revolver, not to threaten, but to hold order. His eyes shifted between the husband and the wife, weighing the scales of justice in silence. The people, too, began to turn. Some looked at the husband with suspicion, others with anger, and a few with open disgust. The tide of opinion was shifting, and he could feel it pressing against him like a rising flood. Her husband clenched his fists, his pride refusing to break. But pride could not mask the fear that now flickered in his eyes. The woman he had thought silenced forever had returned not just to confront him, but to strip him bare before the very people who had once admired him. And in the unforgiving land of the West, there was no greater weapon than truth revealed under the burning sun. The husband's voice rose, desperate, trying to claw back control. "She lies," he shouted, his eyes darting across the crowd. "This woman is bitter, poisoned by the years she spent wandering. She brings nothing but shame, and now she dares return to destroy me." His words cracked with the weight of fear, but still he tried to cloak them in authority. For a moment, a hush fell, as if the town itself weighed his defense against the evidence she had revealed. The wife did not flinch. She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "If I were a liar, I would have never returned," she said calmly, her voice cutting through his rage like steel through cloth. "I carry no weapon, only the truth. And the truth has waited long enough to be spoken." Her words carried a power that reached beyond the crowd. They struck at the very soul of the West, where reputation was everything, and where lies were more deadly than bullets. Among the crowd, old faces stirred. A gray-haired woman whispered of the night the wife had been cast out, recalling her pleas of innocence drowned out by her husband's fury. A ranch hand lowered his hat, ashamed of the role he had played in repeating gossip he never questioned. And a boy, now grown, remembered the kindness she had once shown him when no one else did. Memories rose like ghosts, and with them came guilt that settled heavy on the townsfolk's shoulders. The sheriff's voice broke the silence. "You've ruled this town with pride, but pride doesn't make a man honest," he said, his tone even but sharp. "What she carries is proof, and no amount of shouting will erase what's written here." He held one of the letters she had offered, scanning the faded ink that bore her family seal. The evidence was undeniable, and the husband's face twisted as the ground beneath him gave way. For the first time, he looked small, not the powerful man who had walked with arrogance, but a figure hollowed by his own deceit. The wife, once humiliated and broken, now stood taller than him, her presence commanding the very respect he had stolen. In that moment, the town realized that the reckoning they were witnessing was not merely between husband and wife, but between falsehood and truth, between the man they thought they knew and the woman who carried the strength of survival in her scars. The husband staggered back a step, his eyes wild, searching for escape. He had spent years weaving lies so tightly that even he had begun to believe them. But now, with the truth unfurled for all to see, there was no thread left to cling to. Desperation flashed across his face, the kind that turns men into cornered animals. His hand twitched toward the revolver at his side, not in defense of honor, but in fear of losing everything he had stolen. The wife did not move, though the crowd tensed. Her eyes locked on his hand, unblinking, as though daring him to draw. The desert wind carried a heavy stillness, the kind that comes just before a storm breaks. Every person in that street knew that if he reached for the gun, there would be no turning back. His reputation was already shattered. Only violence remained to prop up the ruins of his pride. But before steel could clear leather, the sheriff's revolver was already in his hand, steady and unwavering. "Don't," the lawman warned, his voice a low growl. You've lied long enough. Don't let your pride finish what your deceit began. The crowd, once hesitant, now shifted fully against the husband, their eyes no longer filled with admiration but with judgment and disdain. The husband's hand froze, hovering over the weapon that had once made him feel invincible. Slowly, trembling, he pulled it back, his shoulders sagging under the weight of defeat. For years, he had believed himself untouchable, yet now he stood exposed, his empire of lies crumbling in the dust. The silence of the crowd was louder than any gunshot, a verdict passed not by the sheriff, but by every gaze that bore down on him. The wife took a step forward, her voice carrying across the street with a calm that silenced even the whispers. I was cast out in shame, but shame was never mine to bear. It belonged to him, and to every lie that bound this town in silence. Now you see him as he truly is. Her words echoed through the air, and the people felt the truth settle like an iron weight upon their hearts. In that moment, the West itself seemed to shift, reclaiming the balance between justice and deceit. The husband's face twisted with rage and humiliation, his pride crumbling under the weight of every watching eye. He had lived as though his lies were law, and now the law of truth had stripped him bare. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence of the crowd swallowed him whole, a silence that judged more harshly than any shout. His empire of deceit had fallen, not with a bullet, but with the voice of the woman he had cast aside. The wife stood tall, her scars no longer symbols of exile, but of endurance. She had been broken once, left to wander in dust and hunger, but she had returned carrying something stronger than vengeance. She carried the weight of truth. And in the West, truth was more dangerous than steel, for it could outlast both bullets and blood. Her presence was a reminder that no lie, no matter how carefully built, could stand against the relentless march of time. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but this time it was not whispers of scandal, it was acknowledgement. Men who had once defended the husband now hung their heads in shame. Women who had pitied her now met her gaze with respect, and the sheriff himself removed his hat in solemn recognition. The town that had once turned its back on her now stood witness to her vindication, and in their silence she found a justice greater than revenge. The husband staggered down from the saloon porch, his boots dragging against the dirt. His eyes darted from face to face, searching desperately for a single ally, a single soul who still believed his story. But there were none. He had not just betrayed his wife. He had betrayed the trust of the entire town, and trust, once lost, was harder to reclaim than the harshest land. He was a man undone, stripped of honor, left with nothing but the dust that clung to his hands. The wife turned her gaze from him, not out of mercy, but out of finality. He no longer mattered. What mattered was the truth, and that truth now belonged to her, to the town, and to the West itself. She had returned not just to reclaim her dignity, but to prove that even in a land of shadows, light could find its way through. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash, the town stood suspended in the weight of what had unfolded. The wife, once driven out in disgrace, now stood as a testament to resilience, her very presence rewriting the story that had shackled her for so many years. She was no longer the woman who left in shame. She was the woman who returned as truth incarnate. The sheriff cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the crowd with quiet authority. "The West doesn't forgive lies," he said. "And today, we've seen how long shadows can stretch before truth burns them away." His words sealed what the people already knew. The reckoning was complete. The husband's power was broken, his name tarnished beyond repair, while the wife's honor was restored in the eyes of all. Children tugged at their mother's skirts, asking questions about the woman who had once been called a ghost, but now stood taller than the men around her. Old men nodded solemnly, their weathered faces reflecting respect long overdue. For the first time in years, the town carried not whispers of scandal, but the weight of a story that would be told for generations, of a woman who defied shame and reclaimed her place under the scorching western sun. The husband retreated into the shadows, his figure shrinking into obscurity. No one followed him, no one defended him, for the West has no mercy for men who betray both love and truth. His absence mattered less than the woman's presence, for it was she who had reshaped the story, turning ruin into redemption. As the last light faded, she remained at the center of the street, her silhouette framed against the burning sky. She had carried her truth back into the heart of the town, and in doing so, she had reminded them all of a lesson the West never let its people forget. Land, pride, and lies may crumble, but truth endures, stronger than time, sharper than steel, and brighter than the desert sun. The night settled heavy over the town, lanterns flickering to life as the townsfolk lingered, unable to tear themselves away from the weight of what they had witnessed. The wife stood in the glow of firelight, her presence commanding more than admiration. It commanded respect. For years, her story had been told in whispers twisted by deceit, but now it was spoken in silence that carried the weight of revelation. She was no longer a ghost of shame. She was the living embodiment of truth rising from the dust. The husband, once so feared and envied, now wandered aimlessly at the edge of the crowd. His shoulders, once squared with arrogance, slumped under the burden of exposure. Every glance cast his way carried judgment sharper than any blade, and he felt the sting of isolation like a wound that would never heal. The same people who had once cheered his name now turned from him, their faith shattered beyond repair. The sheriff remained close, watching both with the stern eyes of a man who had seen pride ruin more lives than bullets ever could. He offered no comfort to the fallen husband, no applause for the wife, only the simple acknowledgement that justice, in its rawest form, had taken its course. In the West, justice was not always written in law books or measured by juries. Sometimes, it walked back into town in the shape of a woman with scars and proof. Children whispered to each other, their eyes wide as they looked upon her with awe. For them, she was not just a woman wronged. She was a legend in the making, a reminder that strength often grows in silence and blooms in the unlikeliest of returns. Their parents, too, recognized the deeper truth, that her survival had given them more than scandal ever could. It had given them an example of endurance, of dignity, of courage forged in the harshest fires. And though the husband stood only a few steps away, he had already become a shadow. She did not need to strike him down, nor humiliate him further. The truth had already done the work, and in the Old West, that was the final blow a man could not survive. As dawn approached, the town began to scatter, returning to their homes with heavy hearts and restless minds. Yet even in the quiet, the story clung to them, etched into memory like a brand on cattle. Around kitchen tables and in the corners of saloons, they would speak not of the man's lies, but of the woman's return, her endurance, her strength, and her triumph over the silence that once buried her. The wife remained in the center of the street, the rising sun painting her figure in gold. She did not smile, nor boast, for hers was not a victory born of revenge. It was a reclamation of her name, her dignity, and her rightful place among the people who had once abandoned her. She had proven not only her husband's deceit, but also her own unyielding spirit. And in the West, spirit was more powerful than steel. Her husband's house stood tall on the outskirts, its frame built with stolen inheritance and lies. Now it loomed like an empty monument, its walls hollow, its meaning stripped away. He had believed that wealth and pride could outlive truth, but the desert had shown otherwise. In the end, his fortune was nothing but dust, while her honor had become immortal. The sheriff, before turning away, tipped his hat in her direction. "You've carried your burden farther than most men carry their guns," he said quietly. "And today, you've laid it down where it belongs." His words were simple, yet they marked the closing of a chapter the town would never forget. As the horizon stretched wide and endless before her, the wife knew her journey was not finished. The West had a way of testing those who dared to stand tall, and more trials would surely come. But for the first time in years, she carried no shame, only truth and the strength to face whatever waited in the desert ahead. Morning broke heavy with silence, the kind that carried more weight than the gunfire of the night before. The wife stood in the center of town, her figure sharp against the rising sun, while her husband lingered in the shadows, a hollow man stripped of his false glory. The people stirred quietly, their eyes drifting not to him, but to her, the woman who had returned from exile, carrying the only weapon the West truly feared, the truth. She breathed in the desert air, the dust and heat reminding her of every step she had taken in solitude. Once, she had thought survival was punishment. Now she knew it had been preparation. Every scar, every night of hunger, every whispered insult had carved her into something stronger. She was no longer the woman who had been broken. She was the woman who had risen. The townsfolk began to approach, slowly, cautiously, as though nearing a sacred figure. One by one, they offered quiet nods, lowered hats, or whispered apologies long overdue. The woman accepted none of it with pride nor bitterness. She simply stood, her silence carrying more weight than speeches ever could. She had no need to prove herself anymore. The West had done it for her. Her husband, shrinking under the gaze of those who once adored him, tried to speak again, but the words tangled in his throat. The people turned away, uninterested in excuses. His fall was complete, not through violence, but through the slow, crushing weight of truth that left him smaller with every passing glance. He was no outlaw, no gunslinger, no hero, just a man undone by his own deceit. And in that moment, the town realized something greater. They had not just witnessed the downfall of one man, but the triumph of endurance itself. The betrayed wife had returned, not to destroy, but to reveal. And in doing so, she had carved her name into the memory of the West, where legends were born not only from blood and steel, but from courage that refused to die. As the day wore on, the town carried on its rhythm, but the air was changed. The blacksmith's hammer rang sharper, the children's laughter carried farther, and every conversation whispered her name with a mixture of awe and guilt. The story would be told for years, not as gossip, but as a warning, a reminder that lies are seeds that never stay buried. The wife prepared her horse, the weight of the desert pulling her forward. She did not plan to stay. Her return was never about reclaiming the town, but about reclaiming herself. She looked once at the home she had lost, its walls now meaningless, and felt no desire to step inside. That house had been built on betrayal, but she had built herself on truth. And that truth was worth more than land, wealth, or reputation. Her husband remained behind, his legacy shattered. He had thought her return would ruin her, but it had only ruined him. In the unforgiving land of the West, pride without honor was nothing but dust, and dust was all he had left. His story would fade, while hers would live on in every whisper, every lesson, every warning spoken under the burning sun. She mounted her horse with the calm of someone who no longer carried shame, only strength. The townsfolk watched in silence, knowing they would never forget the image of her riding away, not as a victim, but as a figure reborn. She had been cast out in disgrace, but she left as something far greater, a legend carved into the very fabric of the West. And as her silhouette disappeared into the horizon, the lesson lingered like the echo of hooves across the plains. No lie, no betrayal, no cruelty can outlast the truth. For the West, harsh and unforgiving, has always belonged not to the proud, but to the ones who endure. The West does not forgive, but it never forgets, and that is what gave power to her return. What began as exile ended as redemption, for the wife who once walked away in disgrace came back not with vengeance, but with proof, with courage, and with the will to face the lies that had built her husband's false kingdom. She showed the town that honor is not claimed by pride or power, but by truth that refuses to be silenced. Her story is a reminder that time, no matter how many years pass, does not erase the past. It reveals it. The husband thought his lies would grow roots deeper than memory, but roots built on deceit eventually rot. The wife's scars became her strength, her silence became her weapon, and her endurance became her legacy. In her resilience, the West found its truest lesson, that those who endure carry a force greater than any gun. The people of the town learned that day that betrayal can build shadows, but only for a season. The sun will always rise, burning away the falsehoods and illuminating the strength of those cast aside. And when the truth finally stood in the center of the street, it was undeniable, sharper than steel, brighter than fire. The woman who left broken returned whole, and the man who thought himself unshakable crumbled into dust. What remains after her story is not just the fall of a man, but the rise of a legend. Her courage will be whispered in kitchens, repeated in saloons, and carried on the wind across the plains. She became proof that the West belongs not to those who shout the loudest, but to those who survive the silence, who walk through shame and return carrying truth like a banner. Her name will outlast his, for truth always outlives lies. If this story stirred something within you, let your voice be heard. Share your reflections in the comments. Tell us what this tale made you feel, and ride with us by subscribing to the channel. Every like, every thought, every word you leave ensures that stories like this, of survival, courage, and truth, continue to echo far beyond the desert winds.